All right. Hello and welcome, everyone. I'm Scott Wright, CEO of ClickArmor, and I help businesses reduce losses from things like phishing and social engineering, scams, ransomware, and even non-compliances. So we're going to talk today about getting the most value from phishing assessments. You know, the things where your IT team sends out these fake messages trying to trick people, right, into clicking on links or attachments. And it sometimes can be annoying, but there's actually a reason why they do this. And if you're an IT manager or an executive on this session, you'll understand what the reasons are. But I'm going to dig a little deeper in this session based on my experience from years of conducting phishing assessments to try and get a deeper view of whether or not you're getting value on these simulations. And so I've developed something called the Phishing Assessment Optimizer. We're going to go through it and hopefully you'll learn some cool things. And at the end, if you stay to the end, you'll get an interesting view on what I think we can do to do a much better job of getting value from these initiatives for trying to assess people's awareness of phishing and improve how they're actually able to handle phishing messages. So stick around. I really would love to get your input on this session, see if it provides value to you. But to start with, what I want to do is check in and see who is joining us from around the world. So right now I've got, let's see, Sue from Halifax, Dave from Australia, awesome, and a couple from Ottawa, Matt and Eli, awesome. So I'm going to just go through a few of the preliminary things that I need people to understand a little bit about, some of the background, why I think it's important for someone like me to share these things, because I see that not a lot of people are asking questions that would enable people to discover whether they're getting value out of their phishing assessments or not. So I'm going to take you back to 2008, 2009, 2010, when I had been a security engineer doing security risk assessments and lots of different security projects, big IT projects. And I saw that there was actually a need for people to focus more on security awareness. But we really didn't treat it the same way on the human side as we did on the technical side. On the technical side, we could do all kinds of network tests, getting data, and we could actually discover what the risks were to an organization or a system based on some of the aspects of it, like what's the asset value? What are the things that we're trying to protect? And what can we lose if they actually get compromised? And then there's the threats, which are the actors, bad guys that are trying to get to those things, steal them, damage them, corrupt them, commit fraud, etc. And in the middle is what a lot of people don't understand. It's the vulnerability aspect of it and the things that people actually need to consider as to what is preventing the threat, like the thief, from accessing the assets. So think of it in your home security system, for example. You've got your electronics, your iPad, your TVs, etc. And those are of value. And if you lost them, you'd be suffering a financial loss. But also the threat, who is the thief, the bad guy trying to break into your house, knows that those things are there and is aiming to get them. The only thing stopping him, presumably, is your door with a lock on it. Now, if the door wasn't locked, then that's a high vulnerability. So whenever we get a larger amount of vulnerability, we increase the risk. And we can measure that with a lot of data and models on the technical side, but we don't often do that on the human side. And so to try and get a metric around the vulnerability of humans is really important in order for us to be able to manage risks. And that really, risk management, people don't really understand that well sometimes. And what that really just means is prioritizing what would be the next thing I would do to get if I had money to spend on security, what would be the next thing I would do to improve security for our systems? And so when you can categorize the vulnerabilities better, then you can better understand where you're vulnerable and what you need to invest in for security. So back in 2010, there was almost nothing in terms of metrics around the vulnerability of humans to stop an attacker who was trying to launch malware on your computer. Ransomware didn't even exist back then. And so there was not a lot of data. And so I started doing something called the Honey Stick Project, which I talked about in my last webinar on becoming a security champion. It was really just a project of dropping USB drives and eventually smartphones with some measurements capability on them to see what people would do with them. And that gave me some data to talk about around the vulnerability of humans. And around the same time, maybe a little bit later, these phishing assessments came out from a number of big vendors, KnowBe4, Proofpoint. Well, actually, at the time it was Wombat, Cofense, SANS. So there were a lot of these tools that came out, and they were using similar actual technology and mechanisms to what I was using in the Honey Stick project. So it actually made my job a lot easier to use these tools, and I used them for quite a while. But I also recognize what the value was in doing these things, how the data could be used. And along the way, though, I found some issues. It's important, though, to actually look at what are the things we're trying to do. So as I said, we're trying to measure human vulnerabilities. We need to be able to understand how easily can somebody be tricked by an attacker. And the easier it is, the more we could expect to lose in an attack. So we need to try and measure and improve people's ability to stop these things. Next, the ability to have some kind of a teachable moment. It was really attractive with phishing assessments or simulations, these fake emails sent by the IT team, to be able to measure what when somebody would open a link in an email, they would actually get sent to a landing page set up by the IT team saying, "Hey, this was a test. No, don't worry, there's no ransomware, but you really should have spotted these things." So it is a teachable moment. I was going to put, a president looking at the clips here, but I thought I might get hit with a copyright violation. I think we all understand, right? So sometimes it takes a bit of a shock to teach people something and they'll remember it. And that was something that early on with phishing assessments, we recognized it could be a teachable moment. We could get people to remember when they clicked on, an impersonation email from the help desk, and it really wasn't. And they learned some things that they should do differently next time. So that was something we were trying to get to, was the teachable moments, in addition to being able to measure their vulnerability. But there are a couple of other things that people really didn't spend a lot of time thinking about, except it was inherently somewhat obvious. But it's important to understand the impacts sometimes. And so business productivity is one of them, both from the point of view of the IT team who's deploying these things. How much time does it take them? They're already busy and stressed out. How easy is it for them to run these tests and make use of them? And what we found with phishing assessments is actually really easy to run, really easy to get some data, because it's every time somebody clicks on a link, they actually get some feedback, and they get the data, and they expect people will actually learn from the types of things that they're clicking on and the landing pages that they get to. So when we see the productivity impact for IT people, we see, okay, well, if it's easy for them to do, then yeah, let's look at more closely to doing phishing assessments using these tools. And we also have to take into account, how does it impact the productivity of the whole team? So everybody that's getting these messages has to spend a bit of time analyzing it and responding to it. And it seems really easy and nice in the traditional phishing simulations that all these messages just come into people's inboxes. They don't have to take time and go do training somewhere for an hour and then come back and get back to their job, change context. So the productivity aspect of phishing assessments actually seemed pretty attractive, because it was easy for the IT team. It was easy for people to kind of just deal with incoming message and get on with their work. And then after that, we also have to consider, what are the cultural repercussions? And we really didn't see this initially, but I actually saw it, in some of my early projects that I did with customers on phishing assessments. And to give an example, there's a few here that have come up in the last few years. So GoDaddy last year got in the news because they used a holiday bonus as an incentive for trying to get people to click on these links. And of course, during COVID, that's seen as kind of insensitive. There was a lot of backlash. People went on social media and it was a PR disaster, really. Similarly, the Chicago Tribune did the same kind of thing. They offered $10,000 bonuses. And again, people were enraged. And a more recent one is the ICF Next. It's a marketing company. They promised vaccinations in their phishing test messages. And that was actually not great either. People were feeling that was really insensitive, bad taste, etc. So, the feedback coming from people was, geez, are these things really, a problem now? And interestingly, one of the reporters went and talked to one of the vendors and said, well, what about these things? Your customers are doing these things and it's causing them all kinds of pain and PR disasters. And the best the vendor could say was, well, you have to be really careful about what kind of messages you actually put in these things. Otherwise, you could get some blowback. So they're trying to minimize the real risks here, but it really is a problem, and we're going to see more of these going forward. So I'm going to go a little deeper into what causes these things and how we're going to try to address them. So I created this checklist called the Phishing Assessment Optimizer, and I just wanted to collect all of the lessons learned, whether it was the kinds of things that the IT manager collecting and running these tests could do to do a better job, or to try and communicate better with people and help set their expectations and make sure that we're not causing big cultural disruptions. So lots of things to take into account here. So I'm going to do a really quick poll. I just wanted to see if people kind of get an idea how many problems we're actually talking about. So I'm just going to launch the poll and see what our respondents say. Give them a few seconds to come back. I'm giving options of 5 major pitfalls, 8, 11, or 15. And so, okay, I'm going to end the poll. And of course, the answer is always C, right? It's the third one. So it's going to be 11. So good guess for those of you who are on there. So yeah, it is 11 pitfalls we're going to talk about. In fact, there's maybe a couple more that I didn't put on this list, but are worth talking about. So one of them, I'm going to go through each one of these in a little bit of detail, not too much. We're going to skim through them. You'll get the idea. They're not that hard to really understand. But when you look at it, there's a lot of things we've got to think about. So we'll start and see how it goes. So number one is the unpredictable employee actions. So what that means is, kind of like what we saw with people going to Twitter and social media when these companies were sending stuff. In those cases, they were, really unfair things that people were accusing the companies of being, insensitive, et cetera. But it could be for any reason. It could be just some sensational piece of news that people think, oh man, I got to tell more people about this, because the message could be impersonating somebody outside the company. Maybe they're reading it on a business computer, but actually thinking that it came from somewhere outside. So it doesn't matter if they go post on Twitter about it, because it's nothing to do with work. So there are a lot of reasons why people might take some unpredictable action. Now, it's kind of interesting because if you're in the security world and you think about technical penetration tests, you usually hire a consultant or a specialist in the organization to come and do a test. And there's always got to be this agreement that says what could go wrong. And I'm going to, absolve the contractor or the tester of any responsibility if something does go wrong. So we can pretty easily identify, systems could go down, databases could get corrupted, but there's some finite amount of impact that can typically be expected from a technical penetration test. That's not really true on the testing of humans, because you really don't know what they might do with, in a reaction to one of the messages that you sent. So the guidance here is, discuss the expected and potential results of each test message and the risks that come with them with management to make sure that they're, not going to cause some weird kind of fallout. An example that I actually had when I was doing the Honey Stick project, it's very similar though, is I was hired by an organization to do a drop of, 50 USB drives. And we sort of set it all up. I said, does everybody know in the organization what they should be doing if they find something like this? Have they been trained on it? And especially the help desk, because if the help desk gets somebody bringing this to them, what will they do with them? Well, they're supposed to do this and this and this, and it will go up the chain and it will get to the manager who's actually responsible for the test. So it should all be good. Well, the first thing that happened was over the first day or two, one help desk guy saw 3 of these devices, and they all had files on them called, confidential budget plans or something for the organization. And so instead of escalating it up the chain in the help desk, they actually went to one of the executives in the organization who wasn't aware of the test. And so we saw some fallout come down to the manager that hired me to do the job, and a little bit of effort was and maybe some credibility was expended in trying to explain what was going on here. So just that kind of thing. You just want to be able to try and anticipate what are the things that could come out of it. Number 2 is what I call the impossibly difficult test messages. As security people and IT people in general, we think we're pretty smart, and we like to try and show people how smart we are. And sometimes it bleeds into this kind of stuff for developing test messages. And you say, well, you know what? I could do a really tough one, and I think I could catch 30% or 50%. Maybe everybody will fall for this. That's not really the point. The point is not to show people that we're smarter than them. It's to leave fair clues and give people a chance to exercise their skills, presumably that you've taught them how to analyze and respond to. So you shouldn't be having too much fun trying to trick users. It's actually kind of difficult to create the perfect message that is not just something that will challenge them, but something that is fair. Number 3 is embarrassing your employees. So there are cases where sometimes a phishing message might be a little bit over the top. You see lots of spam telling people that, they've been hacked and stuff like that. But not everybody understands, that these are potentially just extortion attempts. And so when you have a test like this and maybe a boss clicks on one of these really kind of salacious kind of email messages, and you wonder, gee, what would that person be doing, clicking on or being involved in that kind of thing? So you really want to steer away from things that get into personal habits and stuff like that. It's kind of dangerous to get people to be in a vulnerable situation. You don't want to be leading them too much. So you have to be careful to keep within those bounds. Number 4 is confidentiality. So when you think about it, every time somebody clicks on a link, the raw data that we collect about the fact that that person clicked on a link in that message about that particular topic or that particular kind of threat, it's really personal information, because it's like part of your HR file, the fact that you have this vulnerability, and it could even be of value to attackers. So it's important to try and treat the raw data with high confidentiality safeguards, so that you don't have that kind of risk. There's really no reason for very many people at all to have access to the raw data. What we do want to have is summary data that can tell people how the organization is doing. And there is a need sometimes for remediation to actually approach people and tell people, you know what, this is something you've got to do, or maybe we want to change the program so that it educates people better on some of these things. But it's important to have that confidentiality expectation. There's the issue of people, feeling targeted and feeling like they are being, victimized. And so we want to actually maybe consult the HR or legal department early on, so that we get their buy-in and say, here's why we're doing these tests and what we're actually able to benefit from them. So the HR and legal, when they buy in, they understand, okay, there could be some pushback, there could be some complaints, but we want to get the guidance from them on what will prevent it from becoming a real legal issue. And most of all, we want to prevent it from doing, damage to the corporate culture, the bigger kinds of PR nightmares as well. We don't want people to be reacting badly to. Number 6 is the unpredictable spam filters and settings. So this is a real tricky one, because there are so many different kinds of firewalls and gateways and filtering systems out there that sometimes you're not really sure if people actually saw the message. Mostly we expect that, that you can train a firewall with a whitelist and say, okay, well, so all the messages coming from this phishing testing platform or vendor are whitelisted, so they should all get through. Well, that doesn't always happen. I've been to situations where on the same day, the same message goes to different people, and one of them got blocked and the other one didn't. So the whitelisting issue is a really big challenge, especially in areas where you have potentially very dynamic rules. And so you might have firewalls that are just looking for certain kinds of content, and it might vary from day to day based on rules that it gets from the vendor, for example. So it can be really hard to test and make sure that any message will not get filtered. So these are all kinds of things we have to take into account. And there's also the case of, you can think, well, sometimes people may not see the message. If it does go into a filter, what are we going to do about it? And there are, ways that you can say you're normalizing and sort of compensating for the people who don't see the message. So you might say, well, we can detect if people open a message. And if they open it, then we want to see how many of the people who open the message actually clicked. And that can be helpful, but it also could be that people might be turning off their message or their image previewing. And image previewing is what actually allows the product to track the opening of the email. So if you have an email with an image in it and the email client opens the email and it tries to get the image could be linked to a website. And when it loads that image, then you know that that message has been opened, regardless of whether people click on the link or attachment in it at all. And so that's how we measure open rates. And so you can do some of that normalization based on open rates, but if people have the image preloading turned off, then that skews the data. And if they have it turned off and then they get the message and then they click on it, well, you're getting a click from one that you thought you weren't actually going to get, that was opened. I guess you can say, well, it was obviously open because they clicked on it, but it still is pretty unreliable data. And if you're normalizing the data only because you think maybe they didn't see it, there are a lot of other potential variables that, are in this list as well. So normalization is a big challenge, really. The best you can do really is put disclaimers on the baseline and trend data regarding the variables that are involved, so that when it gets reported, it's not like this is high precision data that says this is how we're doing, and from month to month we're up 0.5%. That's not going to be possible. So people have to understand what kind of data impacts you can have. Another thing that can really impact the data is the level of difficulty in each test message. So what you really want, ultimately, the management wants to be able to look at a trend and say, how are we doing this month or this time around versus last time? And to be able to do that, you have to have some controls. You can't have too many variables. And the easiest thing that gets varied is the difficulty of the actual message. So in this example, I'm using, one of the typical easy messages that you see. You just look at it and say, I know that's suspicious. The one on the right is one kind of like the first one I talked about, the impossibly difficult one. I was actually in a business networking group one time, and during Security Awareness Month, I was offered to try and phish people in the group. And so a bunch of them volunteered, and I knew they were all pretty active in business. So I actually only had to create this one message. And it was really just a bit of a salacious, gossipy kind of email saying, but it was done professionally. It looked really real. And even the person sending it, was a real person. It just wasn't their email address. And so the result was many people clicked on this because it looked so real, and it was so shocking, the fact that somebody's going to be disqualified from the Businesswoman of the Year awards. So just to show, you can have a wide range of difficulty that will really impact how many people will click on the message. So you have to try and keep the difficulty consistent to have usable data. Now, one of the things that I really have found that makes it difficult and makes the data less and less useful is what I call hot button impersonation. So you can have an area of the organization where you're forbidden from impersonating, the payroll department or the help desk. So just a quick story is, doing work for Government of Canada at one time, a department I was doing work for wanted me to, ignore the recommendations that I make about keeping trends sort of consistent and having some common fair types of attacks. And they said, come up with something more difficult that will cause a high click rate, and then we can use that for PR. And I guess that's fair as long as you don't consider that to be something that's in part of your trend. But so the first thing I suggested was, well, let's do one on the Phoenix payroll system, which was a notoriously dangerous payroll system, dangerous in the sense that everybody was afraid. Whenever you saw a notice about Phoenix, if it affected you, it meant you might not be getting paid this month. There were just so many bugs in the system. So as soon as I proposed a message that, you know, invoked Phoenix, they said, oh, no, you can't send anything from that. It'll overwhelm the payroll group. And you can see where this is going, right? So you can't overwhelm the help desk because they have operational things, and if they get overwhelmed, then that's going to hit our productivity and, you know, obligations. So you start to see areas of the company that get sort of cordoned off from these tests, and it makes the test scope smaller and smaller. So it becomes much less useful as a test. And, you know, the attackers are going to be able to guess what those hot button areas are. So you really should try to make them in scope. But on the other hand, recognize that management may just not allow you to test with those particular areas. So number 9, we're moving along, is the curious and rebellious employees. So, you know, what I've seen sometimes is people don't care. You know, we'll talk about remediation probably at some point, but when people click on a link and they get the message saying, hey, you know what, this is bad and you should have done this. There are the people who start to get really curious. The next time they see one, they'll say, I wonder if this is one too, right? So then they click on it and they find out if it's real or not. And sometimes they will actually send out warnings or tell all their friends, and that'll start to skew the data because people will just be clicking on purpose, or the ones that do click on purpose and learn will probably cause a whole bunch of people not to click. So you're going to get a big variation in who will be clicking and not for reasons you don't even know. So really, it's important to try and discourage this. You know, communicate with people, let them know if they do encounter a phishing message. Don't communicate with everybody. It hurts the organization if we can't get a valid measure. So you also want to communicate the aggregate results as soon as possible after a live test, not immediately after necessarily, because you don't want people to necessarily skew your data and say, oh, let's do more, right? But you really want to get people informed within a few days to say, hey, we had a campaign, here's how we did. That can help people understand the value to the organization. So the 10th one I'm going to talk about is a lack of handling guidelines. It's, you know, sometimes unfair, and organizations do this all the time, especially with their first baseline test, to not even give any guidance to say, you know, what are you supposed to do to analyze and spot a phishing message? And what should you do if you find it? Or if you suspect that a message could be a phishing message? So other than having the guidelines on how to spot it, the responses are often, you know, to use the fish hook tool or some kind of reporting tool in your email client to report suspected phishing messages. And that will help us in a way understand the people who do know how to analyze these things. And we also want to make sure people understand that the level of threat needs to be somewhat judged by the receiver to say, does this really constitute a phishing message, or is it just regular spam? Because a lot of the IT teams I've talked to don't want to get a phishing report for every spam message that people get, especially if the spam filters aren't great. So people need to know these guidelines, what they're supposed to be doing to analyze and to report. And if these aren't done, then it's going to have a negative impact on the results. The 11th and final official pitfall I'm going to talk about is these easily spotted tests. So one of the things that I mentioned a little earlier is that sometimes people will suspect that it's a test rather than you know, just trying to analyze a message as if it's a real phishing message. And so what happens is management will say, okay, well, we did a phishing test 6 months ago. We did another one But we need to do them more often, get more data so we can do more of a trend. Well, if you have too much variability in the data already, doing more tests is not going to really help. In fact, it's going to hurt because you will start to see a pattern of people recognizing those tests. And you can, it also gets to be more work for the IT team to do them more frequently. So there's a bit of a trade-off there too. But you really don't want people getting too used to the pattern. So you have to kind of space them out a little bit and not do them too often. So that's the whole list of pitfalls that I've gone through quickly. And I wanted to add one other, and that is when you think about how these tests are being run. I mentioned, we're measuring the click rate. We're seeing how many people click within the test range, a group of people. And we can sometimes detect people that report. But typically I've seen that number, the clickers themselves usually range between 2 on a really, really good test where it's really either really obvious or it's an organization that's very good, up to maybe 15 or 20%, on an ongoing basis. That's pretty high. But aside from that, if you have a reporting mechanism like the fish hook icon or a reporting button, then you can get another 30% of the people to report. So then you've got data on 40 or 50% of the organization and how they actually were able to decide whether or not the message was phishing risk. And so the rest of them don't learn anything. So you won't actually get feedback from anybody unless they have actually made a decision. So that's another sort of pitfall. I'm not going to put it in here as something that you can really easily identify, but it is an inherent problem with testing in this whole live email mechanism. We actually don't have a chance to teach people who don't bother either clicking or reporting. So that's the whole range of them. And when you think about it, that's 11 or 12 actual pitfalls and things that I've had to deal with over many years of doing phishing assessments. As you can imagine, it becomes a big time commitment for the IT team, and there are distractions and people are calling and complaining and management saying, make them harder, make them, easier. And the IT team is already overworked and stressed. So each campaign tends to be a little more difficult or adds to the stress and difficulty level for the administrators. Now, you can get automated systems, and many of them are better now at being automatic at selecting messages to send and scheduling them. And so they can be much more hands-off. The problem with those is that they are actually easier to spot. The test messages that are generated automatically, just because they are trying to stay within that band of not being too not being too provocative, and also they can't be too specific, or else it's not going to be relevant to everybody. So there will be sort of a perfected or a very polished look to those messages that come in as tests, even if they're automatically generated. So it's kind of a tough spot there for the IT guys. So when we're looking at this, I'd like to sort of share that after I've done this for a number of years, I'm going, is live phishing simulation really the best way to do this, given that, we've got all these objectives, trying to get the teachable moments, the vulnerabilities, the business productivity, and the cultural, considerations as well, which the IT team doesn't really have much kind of ability to deal with for every single campaign. So there's a lot of things here that we can think, maybe there is a better way. And so as I was doing that, that's when I started to come across the idea of gamification and gamified learning and assessment. And so I started to study because I had people ask me about it before. They'd say, could we use gamification in our awareness programs? And initially I did actually build a Jeopardy game for, the House of Commons for an IT showcase. And it was obvious that it was one of the most popular booths. And so I got, the idea that there's something there with gamification. But the more I studied it, I realized that there's places like Gartner, there are IT training organizations and other training institutes who have done a lot of studies of gamification, especially around learning. And what I discovered is there are some really interesting parallels and benefits from the gamification aspect of training that parallel and really help with awareness, whether it's phishing or any other kind of awareness training. So I'm just going to sort of quickly go through these. The engagement is obviously the number one. Everybody understands that when something is gamified, it's visually dynamic and interactive. So you get some people's attention and you can get them sort of on board. But that doesn't necessarily last for very long. So you then have to sort of think, what can we do to reinforce our knowledge? Well, games and gamified environments are highly interactive, and they can provide you with challenges that make you think and keep reinforcing your knowledge. People don't necessarily mind being challenged. They rather have that than having to click through pages and pages of boring training. And then there's the whole idea of scoring and leaderboards that will really drive the competitive side of people. Even if they say they're not a gamer, quite often I see people really like to see that they can move up on the leaderboard or just improve their score over their previous score, even if they don't care so much about the people. But the leaderboard really does kind of drive people's behavior to go back in and improve. And it's that practice that really is valuable in getting people to improve their skills. The other area that is really fun and interesting now too is that you can actually put someone in a captive simulation environment where they can see different kinds of threats that they wouldn't otherwise see, except maybe in the real world. And this is what, live phishing assessments are trying to do, get you into a real risk decision situation. And that's really valuable and important if you don't consider all of the other pitfalls that we just talked about. But if you can put somebody in a simulation environment, they know it's not adversarial, it's not life or death if they click on something and get it wrong. This is where the immediate feedback and the ability of people to see their assessments makes a lot of difference and does help improve people's skills. And then finally, because there has been so much interaction and simulation, there is the ability for us to take all that data about what people did and use that to actually assess people's vulnerability. Rather than using one piece of data that we call a click rate, we actually can measure people's ability to sort multiple messages within a minute or two based on the rules that they've learned. And so it's a very valuable kind of environment to be able to work in. So that was what we created, and my theory was that all of this would work. But now that we actually have some paying customers where we've got people with, over 1,000 employees having gone through our phishing course, we do a baseline test. And we teach people then about, sender information, links and body content and attachments. And after each one, we do a little simulation. And at the end, we'll do a final test to see how they do at sorting the same messages that they had at the beginning. And it's virtually impossible for them to remember, the baseline test after having all the interactive challenges. And so sometime later, they're going to do the final test and they see a huge improvement in their ability to spot those messages. So we can actually measure, 50% improvement on average. It's consistent across the different organizations. So it's not just a gimmick or a fad. Gamification really is driving people's ability to improve their proficiency at spotting phishing messages. So how does this actually stack up with respect to our live phishing simulations and exercises that are being done now? Is there an apples to apples kind of benefits versus pitfalls? So when you look at, the engagement side of things, people's participation in phishing assessments, it's kind of hit and miss. You don't know whether people are going to engage in any given message. But with a gamified system, everybody goes through and they kind of engage because it is inviting them and it's a more pleasurable experience. So the next pitfall that we talked a bit about was firewalls and gateways and the filtering and did people open this stuff or not. So we have a lot less firewall and gateway issues when we have just a normal kind of a environment that's in the cloud as a platform. We're not expecting any malicious messages to be coming at you. So there's a much less chance that a firewall or gateway is going to block the whole system. So it becomes less of a hassle for every time you're trying to test people. The testing scope is much broader for a gamified phishing assessment area because we can put people in those simulations for the help desk or the payroll, things that you can't do with the phishing message because management won't let you. So then the culture issue, obviously, gamification is a much more positive environment and approach that a lot of people prefer. And then the data that we're getting from people is more consistent. Anybody who's completed the course has gone through all of the similar messages with similar difficulties. And we can test everybody on the more difficult ones or on the easier ones, but we're getting consistent data, apples to apples. We have even more scope available because we can go way beyond phishing. We can go to social engineering. We can do scams. We can do fraud, even wire fraud and other kinds of things. We can use what we call social simulations. They are not using our phishing simulator, but we have a little choose your own adventure kind of thing. It's specially designed not to waste people's time. So it actually takes you through social simulations, but that's just a different avenue that you can benefit from beyond phishing. And then of course, all the data that we're getting is much more valuable for the point of view of measuring people's vulnerability. We can really get beyond the participation and completion into what is the proficiency and therefore what is the vulnerability of our team. So what can you do now with respect to this information? If you still think, okay, I've got to keep using my phishing simulators, whether you're just being told to do that, or you think it's still got value for you and you're able to compensate for all those pitfalls and you've got the time to deal with all that stuff, then the Phishing Assessment Optimizer PDF is downloadable. It's got a lot of these, it's got every one of these pitfalls that we talked about with the impacts and the guidance. So that's something that I hope you'll be able to have a look at. And if you decide, what, it might be worth looking at gamification because there's something there, right? It really is showing some good promise, some good results. So we have a couple of things that I'm going to suggest. Number one is actually, we have a free assessment online called canibefished.com. And it's really just a place you can go and do a 3-minute email inbox simulation and test your skills at spotting phishing messages. That this one was all about the COVID pandemic. So it could be messages from the help desk about a change in procedure or something like that, or it could be from the World Health Organization with some pandemic information. So it's a fun little gamified phishing thing where you have to sort safe or suspicious messages. And that just gives you an idea of what that kind of gamified phishing assessment environment looks like. And then we can actually do a free trial for you. We can set up an organization for you to have a few stakeholders, do an evaluation, see if it's able to provide immediate feedback, like I think it will, show you how easy it is to deploy, how much data you get, and how important it can be for your risk management program. So at this point, I want to open it up for some questions. I'm sure there are some questions. We've got people live on the chat here, and I've got some people on the Discord link as well. So I'm going to open up the chat and see what we've got in terms of questions. All right. So first question is, how can you convince managers that the data they are asking for from phishing exercises might not be very reliable? So how do you approach a manager basically to tell them, I don't know if we're getting the most value out of this program. What can we do? Sometimes you'll find managers are just trying to get done what they were asked to do. So if it's an IT manager that's responsible for the program and you want to talk to them and say, there's some documented issues with this kind of approach. Are we addressing them? They may not care. They might just say, I'm doing these things. This is the way I'm told to do it. I'm going to do it. So you might have to go up a level and try and find somebody in senior management or executives, because somebody along the way is doing this to improve the cybersecurity posture and risk posture of the organization. It might be for compliance reasons. So there could be just the need to say they've run them. And in that case, there isn't an awful lot you can do. So hopefully that helps, just trying to engage with people, tell the managers that there is some documentation and you can provide them with the Phishing Assessment Optimizer download and then discuss it with them. I'm happy to discuss it as well. Any other questions? So from Sue, how often should phishing simulations be run to be effective? So that's a good question. As I said, you might think, you should run them fairly often so you can get data and do a trend analysis. But as I showed, the trending data is hard to get right, especially the more often you're running them, the more campaigns you've got to create that are consistent in difficulty. So it depends what your objectives are, but I would say you want to avoid getting to the point where the messages can actually be spotted by people. So in my view, I think if you do it more frequently than once a month, that's a big risk that people are actually going to be able to spot the phishing messages that are just tests. And I would say my recommendation would be probably about quarterly, is about as often as you can get good value out of. I think there's a lot of different considerations there, but anywhere between monthly and quarterly. Let's see. Sem says, does it make sense to do phishing exercises as well as gamified phishing training and assessments? Yeah, actually, it's actually, in my view, a complementary thing. There are reasons to do phishing assessments. For example, in the gamified environment, we can measure people's ability to make a decision in a simulation of a captive, risk environment. It may not be as pressurized an environment. Let's say, when somebody gets a real email, they're considering all the other priorities in the day, and they might be more prone to opening something if it comes in live rather than within the gamified environment. So there is a little bit of, a risk there. So I think that, having phishing assessments once in a while can actually compensate for that. But as I said, you don't want to do the live phishing assessments more than probably quarterly or maybe monthly, but you can actually do the gamified phishing foundational courses initially, and then repeated gamified challenges that come once a month. And you don't have to worry about whether people are expecting them or not. They should be expecting them. And you should be able to keep their skills refreshed by continually doing gamified assessments. And the more you do that, the less often you really need to do the sort of audit type of live phishing simulation. So you could probably do live simulations every 6 months, 3 to 6 months, probably, if you're using gamified assessments and training as well. What do you do about remediation for repeated clickers? So yeah, that's a common question that I get. It's certainly, there are some places that are really strict. They cannot afford for people to be falling for these things. And I've heard someone say, you know what, if somebody fails a phishing test 3 times, they're terminated, which sounds kind of extreme to me, but I'm not going to judge. I'm not going to say, yeah, that's the way to do it. I prefer more of the positive incentives to say, quite often there will be an escalation of activity. So the first time might be an IT security briefing, one-to-one from a manager, or you might invite people to a webinar and say, you know what, your attendance at this webinar will impact your performance review next quarter. That would be, a pretty good alignment of incentives to get people to make sure that they are proficient. But in a gamified world, you might just ask them to go back in and repeat the course and do better on the course, because it's not something that they will have been able to memorize. There's so much interaction and randomness in it. It really does test their abilities, and if they can reinforce their ability to spot specific kinds of risks and then do better on that gamified test, then that could be really the best way to do a remediation. All right. Well, it looks like we're just about out of time. So I just wanted to ask if anybody would be able to type in the chat what their best memory of this session was. Is there any one thing that you learned about it in this session that you feel you should take away? Maybe you might want to talk to managers about, or just something that you'll use to review your own phishing program. I see on the Discord, there's Sue. Yeah, the rebellious employees. That's fun. Yeah, you never know the people who will click on things, even if you have a program that says they're going to get some kind of warning. There's still people that will do it. Sam says, talk to legal and HR. Yeah, so getting buy-in from the legal and HR groups is always good when you're doing any kind of a change or an activity that could impact the culture of the organization or people's responses to that. So definitely good thing to take away. Gamification seems cool and valuable. Yeah, absolutely. And I do encourage people to, try the Can I Be Fished, just to see what it's like, and then reach out if you'd like to set up a trial. All right, so I want to thank everybody for joining us, and I hope I was able to bring some value to the session for you, things that you may be able to think about or take back to the management team and get their feedback on, try and do something maybe a little different, more innovative, and get better value out of these things. So I'd love your feedback, and you can reach out to me on LinkedIn or Twitter, even via our website. There's a little chat bot that has my picture on it. It will pop up, and I'll answer your question there, or we can follow a little bit of a discussion. I just think it's important to get more people engaged in this discussion, understanding what those risks are, making sure management is aware of the risks of what the traditional phishing simulations have, and also the benefits of trying something different like gamification. So I appreciate your support. Hope to see you next time, and have a great day and a great life. Thanks, everybody.